Good morning, everybody. I am Hamza Junaid. I am a business economics major and information systems here at St. Cloud State University. First of all, I really want to thank School of Public Affairs for doing this again this year. We are hearing from some of the top economists of this country, and it's an amazing experience. So thank you so much to the School of Public Affairs for that. So as you guys know, the topic being discussed here today at the 57th Annual Winter Institute is immigration. The importance of this topic can simply be judged by the works of our next distinguished speaker. Immigration has been a striking interest of his, and with his upcoming book, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, specifically discussing this issue, and is being published this October, is the topic of his talk today. He has authored some rather bold and riveting books before this, including The Myth of the American Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, and The Case Against Education. His works have been published in many esteemed scholarly journals, including American Economic Review, Journal of Law and Economics, and Journal of Public Economics. He received his economics degree from University of California, Berkeley in 1993, and his PhD from Princeton in 1997. He is now a professor of economics at George Mason University, adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and he publishes his own blog called EconLog. We are honored and elated to have you amongst us, sir, at the 57th Annual Winter Institute at St. Cloud State University. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming on stage Dr. Bryan Caplan.
All right, great to be here today, and I have to say, I'm always nervous to go against George Borjas. And as he was speaking, I was just getting more nervous because I was realizing, he's not just telling you the wrong thing about immigration. If you were actually to believe him, this would really mean that economics has almost nothing to say about anything useful. Right? Now, again, it's true that what he's saying is true, that these issues are complicated, and furthermore, people do bias their presentation in order to get the result that they want. But if at the end of that you come away saying, really, the data don't tell us much of any use, and we just need to go with our values, then I have to wonder, why are you even bringing us in here? Like, why do we even have economists if that's all that we can do? Now, fortunately, I think we can do a lot better than that, and while we should take George's warnings to heart, in particular, to consider the complexity of the issues and to try to consider the biases of the authors as well as ourselves. Nevertheless, I think we can get very far indeed, and there are many strong, clear results that we should consider. All right. First of all, the social value of labor mobility. In free labor markets, workers tend to move from places where wages are low to places where wages are high. This obviously benefits the workers themselves, and everybody knows that. But important point, this is not the only story that is going on. There is much more to it. When people move from areas where wages are low to places where wages are high, they are actually increasing the productivity of themselves and thereby increasing the productivity of the world. Right? Basic fact about economics is that the main determinant of workers' wages is their productivity. If you look at countries with low wages, these are countries where workers have low productivity. If you look at countries where workers have high wages, these are countries where they also have high productivity. Right? Now, therefore, when workers move in order to increase their wages, they are not just benefiting themselves, they are also increasing the amount of wealth that they produce for society. Right? And this holds equally for high and low-skilled workers. Yes, when a high-skilled programmer moves from India to the United States, they are then going to be producing more value. And even there, you may wonder, why does it even matter where a programmer is? I've asked a bunch of people in computing why this is, and they don't have any good answer. All they can say is, well, all I know is they produce 3 times as much here as they do in India. All right, but it also holds true for low-skilled workers. Even a low-skilled worker that seems to be doing something extremely low-tech, like someone who just moves from Haiti to Miami in order to shine shoes. They might have exactly the same shoe shine kit, and yet a good economist will tell you this person is more productive in the US than they are in Haiti. And you say, how so? Well, they're charging more. It says, well, what does that show? It shows that they are saving more valuable time. So for example, if you save Bill Gates 5 minutes of his time, you've done a lot more for the world than you do if you save me 5 minutes of my time. Because my time is not nearly as valuable as Bill Gates. When Bill Gates has 5 minutes of time, he does amazing things. I do somewhat less amazing things than Bill does. All right, so even then when someone is low-skilled and doing something that appears to be physically the same thing they'd be doing in their home country, they are creating a lot more value simply by saving the time of someone else who has higher productivity. All right. Now, once you start thinking about this and realizing when a person moves from a low-wage place to a high-wage place, they are not enriching just themselves, they are enriching the world, then you realize the same logic is going to hold true when people cross national borders. Right? When workers move to earn higher wages, they also enrich the world. Think about this. How much could you accomplish in Haiti if you were just trapped there? If you were stuck in a refugee camp in Haiti, what would you be able to do with your life? Right? Now, of course, the answer to that's terrible for me, terrible for the person stuck there. But again, it's not the only person that it is terrible for. It is also terrible for everyone that would have actually benefited from exchanging with you. Anyone that would have consumed the product that you make is thereby poor, even though, of course, they don't even know who you are. They're not even aware of your existence because you're stuck. But key part of economics is to explain the hidden costs, the things that could have been, the things that we are losing that we don't miss because we haven't seen them yet, but they are still there nonetheless. All right, my favorite way of explaining this is imagine that we got 1 million farmers stuck in Antarctica. All right, so they're farming the snow. And yes, as you might have been able to tell from the first slide, I'm working on not just a book on this, this is actually a nonfiction graphic novel. So all the thought experiments are illustrated to come to life. But anyway, the idea of the thought experiment is suppose that you've got 1 million farmers stuck in Antarctica, they're farming the snow, eking out a bare, meager existence. Now what happens if some other country says they're allowed to move there and farm there instead? Look, well, obviously this is good for the Antarcticans. Right? But it's not only good for them, because when they move to, say, Argentina, start producing a lot more food in the more productive area, what do they do with all that food? Do they just eat all of their own food? You know, of course not. They're going to go and sell it. They put it on the world market. And so then not only do the Antarcticans benefit, but everyone who consumes food winds up benefiting from this increase in productivity. All right. Now, what is the main point of immigration restrictions? It is to stop the socially beneficial movement. It is to trap talent in places where it produces little rather than allowing it to move to places where it could produce much more. Right. Now, do these restrictions actually stop immigration? Every now and then I hear people say we've had 50 years of open borders. Right? I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, it's extremely difficult for someone who wants to move to the United States to move here. Right? You know, think about this. We have an immigration lottery, and to get in, you have to win the lottery. You literally must win a lottery to get in. It is not an easy thing to do, right? Now, other people say, well, you know, there's like 11 million illegal immigrants already here, so clearly anybody can do it. It's like, no, you need to compare the number that have come illegally to the number that want to, right? And again, as an economist, the simplest thing to do is take a look at what price do people pay to be smuggled illegally into the United States. And even for Mexico, which has the very cheapest rates, still you're usually talking about 2 or 3 years worth of wages for a rural farm worker. So that means that actually enforcement is strict and draconian. Then why are 11 million here? Because the gains are so vast. The gains are so vast that a lot of people will go and make an enormous sacrifice in order to get in, or really only to have a chance of getting in, because, of course, many people who try to get in illegally do get caught and sent back. All right. So, now, what do these restrictions actually accomplish? What do these restrictions actually accomplish? Well, I agree they keep people out of the country. The key thing, though, is this is keeping people from moving from places where their productivity is low to places where their productivity is high. Right? So for starters, what immigration restrictions do is impoverish mankind. Yeah, when I was hearing Cow talking about the refugee camp that she was in, you're just stuck there. What are you able to produce? What can contribute to the world there? Right? You're basically in a prison, or really you are in a prison. Right? Isn't it far better if a person can leave the prison and do something with their lives, thereby not only having a better life themselves, but also being able to contribute to the global economy in the process? All right, now, there is a standard estimate. George actually gave you one of the lower ones. Yes, a more standard estimate is that under open borders, the GDP, or really GWP, gross world product, would double. Now, George is quite right. Wait, have we ever seen this? Well, not for a couple centuries anyway, so things have changed a bit since then, and we should be careful. But nevertheless, any reasonable estimate of the size of this gain is going to be enormous, because the differences in productivity between countries are so large, and we have clear-cut evidence that when you move a person from a low productivity to a high productivity country, their productivity very quickly dramatically rises. Not to the same level as the receiving country, but still, most of the problem with low productivity on Earth is people being in the wrong country, not that they are not the right person to be able to do a good job. All right, and this is why there is the slogan that I believe Michael Clemens came up with that George was making fun of, but I believe the slogan, trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk. There are enormous gains in the production of mankind to be had from allowing talent to move from places where it's accomplishing very little to places where it accomplishes much. And again, just think about what you would be able to do with your life stuck in Haiti. Right, and then think about all of the other people around the world in a very similar situation, who not only are enduring an unpleasant situation for themselves, but are also depriving the world of the fruits of their talents. All right. Yeah. All right. Now, impoverishing the world impoverishes us. Most people who analyze immigration ignore almost all of these foregone gains. Right? This was why I was a bit puzzled by George's presentation of these estimates of open borders. Economics is a huge field. There's tens of thousands of articles. And there's only about 5 that have even done this thing that George is talking about. So I would say, rather than this being a live topic, it's one of the most neglected topics in all of social science. All right. But anyway, even people that we think of as pro-immigration writers usually do focus on the gains from high-skilled immigration. So they talk about, wouldn't it be great if we could get some more doctors here or get some more computer programmers here? And that's all well and good, but it's just a tiny fraction of everything that we could actually accomplish. All right. Now, the rare analysts who do acknowledge the gains that I'm talking about, right, will usually dismiss them by saying that almost all of them just go to the immigrants themselves anyway, right? And if you're paying attention to George's slides, when he was calculating that $50 billion gain, he was leaving off the gains to the immigrants themselves, right, which is, of course, an enormous thing. So when he says immigration is a wash, even his stories, it's a wash for Americans, but also an enormous gain for the immigrants. And again, normally, of course, when an economist hears that you can do some great thing for the mankind at zero net cost to yourself, that is a reason to totally do it. But that was not George's answer. All right. Now, anyway, this is a very strange assumption to think that all or almost all the gains go to the immigrants, because as a general rule, in fact, as a rule with almost no exceptions I can think of, when there is any big change in production of any kind, almost all of it ends up being broadly beneficial. Whenever there is a large rise in productivity, we almost never see that the gain is concentrated among the people who are right at the epicenter of the improvement. Instead, there is a vast gain that spreads out to a much larger society. All right, so think about Uber, right? Is Uber only good for Uber drivers? Anyone here ever get some of the benefit here? Yes, enormous gains. Right? And Uber is transforming our society. There are people who aren't learning to drive anymore because Uber is a much better option for them. If you just look at it and say, well, sure there's gains, but it's just going to the Uber drivers. Like, how is it just going to the Uber drivers? There's an enormous increase in production, and when there's an enormous increase in production, a lot of that gain is going to go, of course, to the consumers. The internet. Do most of the gains of the internet go to Bill Gates, right? And a few other people in Silicon Valley? Right? You look around and you see, wait, how can that even be, since almost everything on the internet is free anyway? Right? So this is a fantastic free product. If you described the internet to me when I was a teenager, I just would have said, a world like that is utopia. There's no point even considering it could ever exist. It's just a total daydream. And now we get it, and not only do we get it practically for free, and yet, the ingratitude. The ingratitude does always bother me. So if you live long enough, you will notice it. All right, or antibiotics. Did most of the gains from antibiotics go to the people who figured out how to make antibiotics? No, almost all the gain goes to the people who don't die. Right, that's where almost all the gain goes to. Or tractors. Is it tractor manufacturers who have or the main ones who have benefited from tractors? No, it's people who eat food are the main ones who have benefited from tractors. Right? Anytime you have a large increase in productivity, the main effect is a general large rise in the standard of living, and the effects on the people who are directly there, so important too, but is such a small part of the overall story. Or again, if you want to step back, think about what about the gains from the Industrial Revolution? Those primarily going to industrialists, right? And so that was the Marxist story, perhaps. But even in the Communist Manifesto, Marx briefly acknowledged, yeah, there's a lot of production going on here, but who consumes this production? Right? There's a limit to how much food Bill Gates can personally eat. Right? Most of this gain winds up going to a vast number of other people. All right, now, since immigration restrictions drastically reduce global production, they are almost surely impoverishing us as well. Right now, I agree with George that if you say every single person benefits, that is an overstatement. Right? Because you can always find in a world of over 7 billion people some unfortunate and tragic story. But if you were to go and say how many people today are worse off because the Industrial Revolution happened, you'd really have to rack your brain to figure out who those people are. Right? So maybe if you you live in a monastery and you're extremely misanthropic, you don't like other people enjoying their lives, maybe you're worse off and things were better before the Industrial Revolution. Although, then again, maybe you would have died in childhood and wouldn't have gotten to be a misanthropic monk if this hadn't happened. So maybe even you too are alive to enjoy your misanthropy because of the progress of the Industrial Revolution. All right, the question of trickle-down economics came up. I prefer the phrase Niagara Falls economics, right? And I even got a picture. Yes. All right. So that character is me, by the way, since I'm the narrator of the book, saying open borders is not trickle-down economics. It's Niagara Falls economics. If there is an enormous flood of production, if we're talking anything in the ballpark of doubling the production of mankind, almost everyone will benefit. Again, possibly excepting the misanthropic monks. But other than them, an enormous and massive outpouring of gain. All right, now, what are we losing right now? What are the gains that we are missing out on? Right? Because I'm the last one to say that things are bad in the United States right now. I look around and I see an amazing world. But I also see a world that could be more amazing. And it should be amazing for a larger number of people. And why not? All right, so what are we missing? Tons of cheap products. Think about everything great about Walmart and Costco, and then getting a lot more of that. In 1980, people didn't miss having Walmart or Costco. They never had them, so they said, hey, well, they didn't even say hey. They just lived their lives unaware of how much better their lives could be. Now we have these stores that sell us a vast quantities of cheap products, and we appreciate it, right? And we could have a lot more of that in a world where anyone could take a job anywhere. What are we losing? Tons of cheap services. Think Uber for everything, right? Think of all of the other things in your life that could be more convenient if there were someone around that would be willing to do it for you, right? There are a vast number of service sector jobs now, but there's plenty of room for others. All right, what are we missing? We're also missing large gains in U.S. real estate values. Yes, very, very general result. If you want real estate values to be high in your area, you want people to be there. You don't want to be in an empty area. I remember during the last recession, my dad, who, by the way, is probably the angriest critic of immigration I know, my dad owns a home in L.A. The value of his home went from about $1 million to $500,000, and all he could say was, well, there is one good thing about this recession. At least the immigrants are going home. Right? Do you think that them going home could have anything to do with losing $500,000 in real estate value, Dad? Right, but he didn't think, he wasn't interested in that anyway. All right, so a large increase in real estate value, and of course, what is, if you were concerned about Americans getting enough of the gains, what is the nationality of the owner of almost all the real estate in the United States right now? Yes, almost all of it is American. So yes, anyone who owns a home or is going to inherit from someone who owns a home is going to benefit from this as a result. All right. And of course, in entrepreneurship and innovation, right? And remember, not all of this is high skilled. Someone who has a dog watching business, that's entrepreneurship. Someone who goes and uses a smartphone app in order to connect dogs to dog washers, that is innovation. Yeah, so right now, New York City is trying to fight an internet business that is basically Uber for dog kennels. Basically, rather than putting your dog in a kennel, you find someone who will take care of the dog for a week, and your dog gets to be in a yard instead of a kennel, and you pay a lot less, right? And of course, this is another example of something that has to be stopped. George might think this is really complicated, but I don't. I think this is a clear-cut gain in productivity, and it's terrible that things like this are being held back. All right, now what about the effects on native wages and jobs? Well, here I am very much with George. It's complicated, but I think we should do more than just say it's complicated and actually try to get to the best possible answer that we can given the evidence that we have. All right, so it all depends upon whether immigrants produce what you produce or produce what you consume. Right? So, for example, immigration has been bad, immigration of professors has been bad for me. Right? So you may have noticed you probably have quite a few immigrant professors, so George is an immigrant professor, right? And yes, there is a panel in my book where it doesn't show George, but it just shows a random Harvard professor who's occupying my office right now. Because, yeah, so when someone guessed that I'm at Harvard, I'm not. But surely if there were no foreign professors in the United States, my prospects of having that job would be greatly improved, right? Right. Now, I'm not actually bitter. I'm happy for everyone. But nevertheless, this is a way in which immigration has hurt my career. I don't see any way around it. Right. However, it's important to always focus on the net. Immigrant professors are bad for me, but all of the other immigrants are good for me. All the immigrants who produce the stuff that I consume, that has been a great gain for me. Right. Just the fact that there's so many immigrant students means that there is a lot more demand for professors. That's good for me. The fact that there are immigrant-run restaurants, it's practically the only places I eat. That's been good for me. To have to eat what Americans would make, I don't want to think about it. All right, anyway, always focus on the net. Because, again, like one standard trick of someone who wants to make you think the progress is bad is to narrow it down to the smallest possible problem and then say, see, that's bad. So it's complicated. It's like, rather than saying it's complicated, why don't we think about all the positives, all the negatives, add them up. And again, remember, the secret of mass consumption is mass production. When there is a very large increase in total production, this is good for almost everyone. Although, of course, you might like there to be great increases in production in everything except what you do, right? But it's not possible to give the world that, because if we stop everything that bothers anybody, we don't get anything. All right. Now, if you think that Americans should get even more from immigration than they currently do, then I'd say the prudent policy is, again, not to listen to George, but rather to welcome them, but to charge them admission fees or surtaxes or something along those lines, and then use that extra money in order to compensate the native-born Americans who have lost out. Right? For example, if you think that native-born American high school dropouts are losing from immigration, you could say there's going to be higher taxes on foreign-born workers, and then you can go and cut the tax rate on low-income native-born workers, right? So rather than it being immigrants took our jobs, it could be immigrants paid our taxes. A better story. All right, so why not? Why not do this thing? Well, estimates of massive economic gains rarely change people's minds. Right? They haven't changed George's mind. I mean, I do wonder, if we could get the doubling, then would George be here saying, I'm totally convinced and let's do it? I feel like he wouldn't. I feel like he'd still be saying, well, sure, there'd be a doubling of GDP and like big increases, but there's still some people who would lose. And, and also maybe it's not that good to be richer anyway. Maybe we lose the... So anyway, I'm not sure what George would say. You can ask him. All right. But anyway, so people who know the numbers rarely challenge the effect on global production. George is one of the main exceptions. Instead, they point to offsetting concerns. Topping the list, first of all, protecting U.S. taxpayers. Second of all, protecting U.S. culture. And third of all, protecting U.S. liberty. How serious are these objections? So anyway, when George says that people don't consider the downsides, I've got a book with chapter after chapter on downsides. I do believe in directly confronting all criticism and complaints, right? But I think that when you do it in a calm spirit, you will realize that the gains are so large that any plausible estimate of the problems just does not compare. All right, so protecting taxpayers. So, simple story here. American welfare state pays more for idleness than many countries pay for work, and this is true, right? And therefore, immigrants come to abuse the system. That part might not be true. All right, now key facts about the American welfare state that, again, most people are barely aware of. The welfare state in the United States, and actually in most rich countries, is primarily about helping the old, not the poor. Most of the money goes to the elderly, not to the poor, right? And once you realize this, well, what is the age of the typical immigrant? Actually tends to be young, All right, so then maybe it's actually more complicated than it seems. All right, and the upshot of this is almost no serious researcher finds a large negative fiscal effect of immigration for U.S. taxpayers. All right, George already showed you the National Academy of Science estimates, so I don't have to. All I'll say is that he showed you 4 numbers for long-run effects. The positive one is the good one, right? don't have time to go over it, but those are the positive one is the one based upon the 2 reasonable assumptions, and the negative ones are not. Even for the negative numbers, when you realize this is an estimate of the net effect for an entire lifetime, it really is coming down to like $1,000 per person per year, right? Which I would say is just not a very large amount in the big scheme of things. All right. Now, rather than try to go over the numbers, I just want to convince you these numbers are not absurd, right? And by the way, if I were you and I was skeptical of this, I wouldn't believe me either, right? Why would you, right? So that's a totally reasonable point to be skeptical of someone who says, here's what the numbers show. My favorite bad saying is studies shows. Like, well, tell me, name 2 of the studies. Right? Most people can't, all right? But anyway. I want to convince you this is not absurd. First of all, why is it not absurd for the net fiscal effect of immigration to actually be positive? Right? First of all, much government spending is what economists call non-rival, namely the cost does not depend upon population. Now, George mentioned fire protection. That's something where plausibly it does actually depend upon population. The main ones that people have talked about where it doesn't. It's like national defense. All right, so if we had a giant baby boom, would anyone say we need more nukes to defend the babies now? Just don't see it. Right? And similarly, the national debt. Right? So whenever countries talk about secession, the main issue that comes up is how we divide the debt. So like if Scotland were to secede from the UK, how would they divide the debt? And I know that if I were a Scottish nationalist, here's what I would say. Does the debt say Scotland on it? Then Scotland's not paying any of it. All right? So if Scotland could actually secede from the UK without accepting any of that debt, that would be a fantastic deal for them because then the debt would all be shoved off onto all the non-Scottish people in the UK, right? And immigration basically does that in reverse. It brings some people here who then help us shoulder the burden of the debt that we've already racked up. Right now, furthermore, even if these complaints were true, why not freely admit immigrants, but limit their eligibility for benefits? I'm always amazed when an economist is so uncreative as to say, well, look, the current number states negative, so we should just keep them out. How about we change policy? How about we reconsider policy, make it more flexible? Why not say that? All right, protecting American culture. This is another common complaint. Immigrants are destroying American culture, won't learn English, etc. So obvious flaw. There is actually a big body of people who do research on this. Standard result is over 90% of second-generation immigrants speak very good English. So people sometimes say, like things have changed a lot since the days of Ellis Island. Actually, they haven't. In the Ellis Island days, first-generation immigrants, when adults, struggled to ever become fluent. It's really hard to learn how to learn a new language. There's a line from Amy Chua where she says, do you know what a foreign accent is? It is a sign of courage, right? Because you are willing to try to learn a new language past the age at which it is easy. But their kids learned English in those days. They learn English today. This is really not much of a problem. All right? There's also a big social science literature on trust. There's a concern that social trust is important for having a viable society or well-functioning society. And it is true that in low-income countries, trust tends to be low. But then again, the question is, does trust assimilate or not? So I've done some work on this. And again, general result is that while there is a bit of retention of the trust of your home country, there's also a lot of assimilation, especially for the next generation. Changing the people that you see changes the way that you see people. Another point people often made is say, look, of course we could have open borders back in the 19th century because things were so much better back then for immigration. This is where I want to say, that's crazy. Things are actually, in important ways, much better now. In 1900, when you had a Sicilian come to Ellis Island, the odds were he spoke no English, had never read anything in English, probably had no familiarity with modern technology, and then he gets off the boat, right? And then then he's got to go and learn a new language from scratch, learn an entirely new economy and culture. Of course, that's going to be a great culture shock. In the modern world, however, we've got about 1.3 billion people who now speak English. Right? Knowledge of Western culture is spread all over the third world due to movies and television. So actually we have a vast supply of people that are what are called pre-assimilated. They're already Americanized before they even show up. Furthermore, even if this complaint were true, even if there really were serious cultural problems with English, why is the solution to keep them out rather than to say you can come, but you can come after you demonstrate fluency in English or after you pass a test of cultural literacy or whatever? Why is it that the solution is so quickly just to kick them out and keep them out rather than to address the specific problem with a narrowly tailored solution? All right, and yes, this is also from the graphic novel. Yes. So there's a lot of people who say, like, it's all based upon the idea there's some kind of magic dirt in the United States, and the magic dirt transforms people. What I say here is, look, it's not that it's the dirt that's magic, it's the culture that's magic. It's that you can take someone who is totally unfamiliar with the modern world, bring them here, they can get by doing a job with that. They probably could have done a lot better if they come younger, but if you come when you're older, it's hard to adapt, although still you can adapt to a reasonable degree. And then their kids grow up here and they assimilate almost totally. Right? So my wife is a Romanian immigrant. She actually, his first generation, came here when she was 7. She speaks Romanian with an American accent, not American with a Romanian accent. Right? So if you can just get people here when they're young, then the assimilation is very strong indeed. All right. All right, and then protecting American liberty. So this is an argument that's very popular among both conservatives and also libertarians, right? And that is to say, look, immigrants come from statist countries. Statist countries. These are countries where they've got big government, where they got socialism, right? So, and the problem is they have their political views they picked up there, and what are they going to do? They're going to come here and try to ruin things. Right? Or they may not be consciously saying themselves, I'm going to try to ruin things. But nevertheless, they'll come for the money, and then once they start voting, they will wind up turning our country into the kind of place that they fled. All right, I'll say a minimum this problem is greatly overstated. First of all, non-natives have low turnout, even controlling for other factors. So the idea that immigrants' first goal is to show up here and then start voting to turn the U.S. into Venezuela or something like that is just not true. It's not generally a priority for someone. Usually when you are an immigrant, your priority is getting your family on its feet, not trying to upset the political order, right? And a further point, there is quite a bit of evidence on support for the welfare state, right? And people often think that immigrants will come here and they will vote for a lot of welfare benefits for themselves. Researchers have also noted there seems to be another factor, which is that when immigrants come, natives seem to become less supportive of the welfare state. Now, of course, you might say, yet another bad thing about immigrants. But again, if your concern is that immigrants are going to come and vote the U.S. into Venezuela, it seems that this is actually at least a much more complicated situation than it seems. And again, even if the complaint were true, why not admit immigrants to work and not to vote? Right? Why not say you can come here, you can have a great life, you can't vote because we're concerned about you messing up the country, but other than that, you are welcome to be here. What's so bad about that? All right, now, let's see. Let me just see how am I doing in time. All right, okay. So now moving on from science to ethics, right? Now, George in some of his writings have said, look, I'm just an economist. I don't think that my views on the ethics of this are particularly better than other people's. I'm just willing to go and defer to more common views. I'll say, so I was an undergraduate philosophy minor, so I'm not like that. I'm someone who's got views on almost everything, right? Doesn't mean I'm right, doesn't mean I'm certain, but I do try to look at the arguments and see what actually makes the most sense. All right. Now I'll say, if what I will consider to be mainstream social science is even roughly correct, then all leading moral theories actually lead to a very similar result. Right? All major moral theories actually do require open borders or something like it. Right? Now, what am I talking about? Well, let's just go through a bunch of the most popular theories in ethics. There's one called utilitarianism. This says that the right action is whatever maximizes the total human happiness. Well, if you have a large increase in the production of the world, and a lot, though not all of that gain, goes to people who are currently quite poor, that seems very likely to lead to an increase in total human happiness. Right? Especially if you remember that that immigrants migrate, probably most commonly for a better job and a better life, although also to escape tyranny, to save their lives, right? That kind of thing, right? So it would seem that almost any utilitarian would have to say that allowing people to go and move to places which will increase production and improve their lives will be a good thing on balance. There's another philosophy called egalitarianism, most often associated with a philosopher named John Rawls. This one gives us an even clearer case. So this says we need to be very concerned about human equality, right? And what does it do for human equality if most human beings are not allowed to work or live in the most lucrative countries? Right? So what is it doing for human equality to say that Haitians have to stay in Haiti? It would seem that it is greatly increasing that inequality, right? And especially if you were to go and take a look, well, what happens if you let a Haitian out? Well, very standardly, his income will rise by a factor of 10, right? This is such a dramatic gain that one Haitian might be able to keep one Haitian working in Miami might be able to keep many Haitian family members who are still stuck in Haiti alive, right? It is that large an effect, right? So, if you care about equality, then you have an extra reason on top of the utilitarian reason to favor open borders. All right, there is libertarianism, a view with which I have considerable sympathy. This one says that all someone is doing is when they want to get a job from a willing employer, rent an apartment from a willing landowner, what business is anyone else saying no? Right? So every now and then someone says, well, don't I have a right to decide who lives in the same country as me? It's like, no. Do you have a right to decide who lives on the same street as you do? Right? If your neighbor is ugly, or like you don't like the religion, or you just find them obnoxious, do you have a right to go and say that your neighbor can't sell his house to them? Right? Not normally. Right? And and that seems to be a very good thing, that you don't have a veto over every possible neighbor you could have. Again, imagine what a world that would look like. And of course, remember, you might get vetoed too. Don't forget that. All right, any case. Every now and then people will say, well, just like a person has a right to their own property, people have a right to their own country. It's like, no. Those are two totally different things, and they're contradictory, right? Because if you've got a right to your own property, the whole point is that you have a right to do stuff that people in your country don't approve of, right? So, for example, if you have a church that is unpopular, private property says you can have the church anyway, even if most people don't like it, right? Whereas if it is the right of the country to decide what they want in the country, then any religion that the country doesn't like, any unpopular religion, you can say that's not allowed to be here, right? So, while people like to analogize private with national property, I'd say they actually are totally different things. In fact, I would say the idea that people in a country have a right to decide whatever happens in their country, that's socialism, right? That is the idea that this is our society and we collectively decide how things work here. Right? On the other hand, private property is precisely about the right of individuals to do what they want with their stuff, and if you don't like it, you can do something else with your own stuff. Then there's a view that non-economists don't talk about so much, but there are some people who say, well, really, we should just do whatever is economically efficient, right? And again, essentially, this comes down to don't worry about whether, what's the simplest way of putting it? Basically, just think about, who has the highest willingness to pay for any particular outcome, what will lead to the greatest increase in total production minus the cost of that production. There's Judge Richard Posner used to talk about this a lot, although he changed his mind. But anyway, if you think the most important thing is just to get a highly cost-efficient society, then again, it's hard to argue with something that leads to a very large increase in the production of the world. Then, meritocracy. Now, when I was looking around for a good spokesperson for this, I came across Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who actually did put a lot of emphasis upon a big part of the secret of our success is just saying that the best person for each job should get the job. Right? And I think that has a lot of moral appeal. Right? And notice I said best person, not best citizen. Right? Is what immigration laws do. It says they say that if the best person for the job doesn't have the right papers, they aren't allowed to have the job. Right? Which seems unfair to me anyway. You may think about it. But anyway, this is another moral view that many people have, and it's one that it seems that we should consider. And then, of course, there's another moral view which has had enormous influence in Western civilization, Christianity. Right, you may have heard of it. Heard of this thing? All right, so yeah, I remember there's the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? And the heart of this parable is that There is an Israelite who's attacked, left by the side of the road. Then there were a bunch of other Israelites, including a rabbi who just ignore him. And then a Samaritan comes along. Now, what is a Samaritan? Actually, it's really just a very slightly different version of Judaism. But at the time, they were considered horrible heretics, and so, terrible people. But anyway, in this parable, the Samaritan, the outsider, is the one that goes and takes care of this guy. Right? He's the one who saves his life. He's the one who provides for him. And then, the punchline of the story is, so who was this person's neighbor? Who was this person's neighbor? Right? It was the man who showed mercy on him. Right? So while people often will talk about, my great sympathy for my fellow citizens, again, so it would seem like if there's any message of Christianity at all, it would be that all human beings are worthy, all human beings' lives count. And to say that I don't care if 1,000 nations die, if I can protect a few American jobs, would seem to be a very strange lesson to draw from the New Testament. All right, so I will end it there, and I'm now happy to take questions. Let's see, I was supposed to have a chair there, actually, wasn't I? So take questions with the chair. Thank you very much. And let's see, is this working now? Is this working? Yeah. This working now? Can you hear it? Is this okay? All right, so why don't we start taking questions now, and then I'll sit down in mid-question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I have a question. So there hasn't been a lot of discussion regarding kind of immigration and crime. I know.
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear.
Oh, that there hasn't been a lot of discussion or I think data regarding immigration and crime in these particular conversations. But how do you feel that incorporates with maybe the larger discussion or the rhetoric regarding immigration?
Yes. Well, I'd say the first thing is there's been a lot of empirical research on immigration and crime, and the standard result out of people who've looked at the numbers is that immigrants have markedly lower crime rates than natives. Basically, for legal immigrants, it seems like they are dramatically lower, and for illegal immigrants, they seem to be similar to those of natives. By the way, a key point is the larger you think that the illegal immigrant population is, the lower their crime rate has to be. Because we know people who are in jail, the population is an estimate. So if there were 100 million illegal immigrants in the US, they would have a remarkably low crime rate because, but anyway, so that's just a matter of the arithmetic. So I say that the main thing is to calm down and look at the numbers, right? Because if all that you do is look at news stories, you can always find a news story that is extraordinarily upsetting, right? That taps the symbolism of the issues. Once I was speaking at the big anti-immigration conference in the US, and they were having a whole session of people who have have had family members murdered by immigrants. All right, and I was like, well, I'm glad I'm not going to be around for that part. Because, of course, it's a terrible thing. What are you going to say to someone whose family member is murdered by an immigrant? Are the numbers going to make them feel any better? I don't think so. And yet I'd say, morally, how is this different from having a panel on people murdered by Albanians? Right? I don't see the difference. You say, yes, well, if you have a bunch of people, some of them are going to do some bad things. If that's an argument for having people in the group that committed the crime around, it's an argument against having anyone around. So, really the only thing that makes sense is to look at the numbers, and the numbers say that in the United States, immigrants have low crime. So, and again, you might say, so, why then do we hear they have high crime? So this is where I think George is right, and people believe what they want to believe, right? And there's a lot of people who do want to find a scapegoat for crime, and if an immigrant does it, they get a lot more upset about it and treat it as much more indicative of a broad social trend than if a native-born person did it.
Okay. One of the expected effects of open border policies will be an increase in social inequality due to increase in capital gains, right? So what will be your thoughts about it?
Right. So when you say social inequality, I'd say that open borders will lead to a large decline in social inequality, but an increase in the visibility of inequality right here. So think about this. Suppose that you wanted to have a society with really low inequality. Suppose you're starting a new country. Here's a way that you could go and keep inequality down. Just don't let any poor people in, and then your country will have very low inequality. And I'd say, the right thing to think about here is, what is the problem with inequality anyway? If you think the problem is just that there are some people who are very poor, who are very badly off, then I would say that It's hard to then letting people go and move to a country where their lives will be much better would seem like actually that is an improvement. I guess the best way of putting it is that under open borders, the actual inequality would go down, but the visibility would go up. And there's the question, is the thing that bothers you the existence of the inequality or its visibility? Right? I would say that on any normal moral view, it's the existence of the inequality that's bad, not the visibility. Right? On the other hand, if it's just I don't like looking at it, then yeah, that is a problem with open borders. Yeah, Marta.
For this discussion. And your graphic novel does remind me of some of the stuff that's been written about Jason DeLeon's Land of Open Graves. I think the New York Times did a graphic piece, and so that was just interesting to me.
So sorry, I didn't hear the book that you were saying?
Jason DeLeon's Land of Open Graves. He's an archaeologist that talks about the consequences of funneling immigrants through the desert. I think, though, you might have addressed my question with the last person's question, was this discussion of wealth distribution. Mm-hmm. And that I followed your argument really well. And how do we make sure, perhaps, or I don't know, make sure is the right question, that people who come here are not completely exploited for their labor?
So how do we make sure that people who come are not completely exploited? I guess the honest answer is there's no way to make sure, right? However, there is a great anti-exploitation device built in the labor market, which is the old saying, if you don't like it here, you can quit. It is tempting to say, oh, that doesn't really have any help. It actually is enormous help, right? So think about all the jobs you wouldn't even consider taking right now because the terms just aren't good enough, right? And for any job, no matter how bad it is, think about why don't they make the terms even worse, right? Why isn't any job that you consider bad already worse? And the answer is going to be that the employers feel like they'd have trouble keeping workers if conditions were worse. So I would say like the main thing that's going on when people move is they're trying to move from a place where their opportunities are poor to a place where their opportunities are better. So I'd say that like the best protection is having a high productivity economy, right? Now I know there are many people who want to have laws to go and say like they want to have a higher minimum wage or something like that. I am also enough of an economist to say it's much more complicated than it seems. So if you just want to get a quick lesson on the minimum wage, there is a classic query, which is, well, if the minimum wage is so good, why not $1 million an hour? Why not $1 million an hour? Right? And at this point, almost anyone would say, well, I guess if we're $1 million an hour, people might not want to hire people for $1 million an hour. And that's right. Right? So then the question is, well, if $1 million an hour reduces unemployment, why do you think that putting it 10% above the regular market wage wouldn't sort of increase? So why is it that 10% increase would not increase unemployment? Again, a lot of work on this, but in the end, I think that the best conclusion is that the minimum wage does reduce employment, and this is a negative effect, right? And furthermore, or on that subject, so once I debated Ron Unz, for Intelligence Squared on this. And he actually has been long pushing a much higher minimum wage combined with harsh punishment for employers. And he said explicitly, why do I do this? Because I think it will disemploy immigrants, and then they'll go home or they won't come. Right? And I say, wow, right? It's good economics. It's nefarious, but nevertheless, your economic reasoning is sound. Yes, so if there are people that are not worth employing for $10 an hour, and you say that the law says you have to do it, and if you get harshly punished for breaking the law, then employers are not going to want to go and offer jobs to lower-skilled immigrants. And if you say $10 an hour, what's so great about that? Well, for someone whose best job back at home is $1 an hour, $10 an hour is great. Let's see. Yes.
Hi. I have a dear friend, Shahid, who is a young man in Bangladesh, fell in love with Milton Friedman and the free market system of America, and set his sights on becoming an American. And he won that lottery eventually. It took him a long time. But he studied here, got a PhD at the University of Minnesota in economics. And he says to me when we're talking about these things, he says, Keem, he pronounces my name that way, you can either have closed borders with welfare, or you can have open borders with no welfare, but you have to choose. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I actually have 5 pages on this in my graphic novel where I'm arguing with Milton. What do I say? If you had an extremely generous welfare state, then thered be a point that open borders would become a problem. However, given the current level of the U.S. welfare state, I say that it's not a problem. Right? So, right now, the average immigrant, despite the welfare state, more than pays for himself in the best estimates. And if you go and break it down, basically, there are certain groups that, even under the best assumptions, right now look like they are fiscal burdens. Particularly, if you were both elderly and low-skilled, then you are a burden. But I'd say that's no more an argument against open borders than saying that there are some babies that are statistically likely to go on welfare is a good argument. Again, if it were something where a large or devastating effect, it'd be a different matter. But I would say that there's no reason you can't combine open borders with a welfare state at the U.S. level. So I'd say that it's oversimplified to say either you can have open borders with no welfare state at all, or you can have closed borders with some welfare state, and say that it really depends upon the size of the welfare state. And at the size that we have, it's not really a problem. So, or in fact, looks like probably would be a net positive overall. By the way, there's one other thing that I should have addressed that I neglected to. So George was totally right when he was showing that estimates of these large gains from immigration do assume billions of people move. Right? And totally agree, and that's what should happen. Billions of people should move. Should they move today? No, billions of people shouldn't move today. How about this year? Should billions of people move this year? No. Right? But should they move over the course of a century? Yes, that would be awesome. Right? Now, I'm saying, how can this happen? Well, while George was talking, I was Googling the U.S. population in 1776. All right, so any idea, what was it roughly? Don't Google. Right? Yeah, so it's about 2.5 million. So we now have well over 100 times as many people as they did back then. Was this a problem? No, because we did it over 250 years. It's not a problem at all. You can totally increase population by a factor of over 100 given that time. Similarly, could we go and increase U.S. population by a factor of 10 over 50 or 100 years? There's no reason why we couldn't do it. Yes, we can. Totally doable. Right? And again, how can it even be done? So, China and India have been doing something like this in their cities. They start off 50 years ago being almost totally rural, and what have they done? They have built vast new cities. It's doable, right? We could do it too, right? Again, of course, it would be a disaster if they all came overnight. But again, so George was mentioning the case of Puerto Rico, I believe. So it is true that there's been an enormous outflow from Puerto Rico, but it didn't all happen at once. When the U.S. Supreme Court first established open borders between the U.S. and Puerto Rico in 1902, only a few thousand people came at first, right? But then it started to snowball. Now, Paul Collier, the author of Exodus that George was mentioning, he calls this diaspora dynamics, and he says this is why you should get really worried about immigration, because it snowballs. And I say, no, this is why it's awesome. Because at first, the number that come is manageable, and then it gradually builds. So in the long run, we do get all these gains, but we also should not fear extreme short-run disruptions, because generally people are scared to be the first immigrant to come from the country where they're coming from. Instead, usually these social networks are really important. That's why immigrants tend to cluster in a certain area. So in terms of climate, it doesn't make any sense for the Hmong to be in Minnesota, right? So why are they here? Well, my guess is that there were first groups of Hmong ended up here for reasons beyond their choice, like maybe they were settled here, or I don't know the details. But once they were there, then other Hmongs who wanted to come wanted to be near other people, near friends and family, other people from the same culture, right? And so the way that immigration normally works, it's not a flood, but rather a gradual building, right? And therefore, you can avoid the serious short-term disruption of having 1 billion people come overnight. And yet, over the long run, you can get all those gains of having billions of people come eventually. So yes, so I don't want to sugarcoat everything. I do want billions of immigrants to move here. Just like in 1776, I would have been saying I want millions to move. And people would have considered me crazy then too.
Thank you. Talking about China and India, I'm from India. Growing up in India, I saw wherever I went to, the best led the country. I mean,
The best?
from the best institutions, educational institutions, the best of the best left for the West, like coming to US, Australia, all the OECD countries. US was a major destination. So immigration of high-skilled people in the literature, we call it brain drain. What is your take on that? Do you
Yes.
think it's damaging the developing world? Thank you.
Right. Great question. Yeah, so brain drain. Here's my first pass. If brain drain is a problem, it is caused by regulation, right? Because right now it is much easier for high-skilled immigrants to get into other countries than it is for low-skilled immigrants. So if you only let high-skilled immigrants in, then you are going to wind up leaving low-skilled immigrants behind. So a key part of my view is that low-skilled immigrants should be able to come too. So they may not be curing cancer, but they still provide useful services. They may free up some of Einstein's time or some of cancer research time so that he can cure cancer. But actually say, you can say a lot more than that. Even out of the immigration that has happened so far, even though it's true that there tends to be more immigration from people who are highly skilled, they wind up sending home a lot of the benefit in the form of remittances. So one person can get in from Haiti and work in a mid-skilled job in the US and then go and help a lot of people back in the home country. So that is another big gain that people back in the home country get. Again, going to Puerto Rico. So the hurricane has messed up the example, but that is coincidence, right? The main thing to know about Puerto Rico, it has long been one of the very richest places in the Caribbean, if not the richest. And even though they've been free to leave, Puerto Ricans have been free to leave Puerto Rico, move to the United States for 100 years and change, and many have, still compared to other places in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico looks great, or did before the hurricane, right? And part of what's going on is people go and send money back. Part of it is that people go and work in the U.S. and then retire in Puerto Rico. Partly people go and get business skills and know-how in the U.S. and then bring them back to Puerto Rico. So I'd say, even the kind of immigration, or Puerto Rico, which is one of the best examples of how open borders would work, we see that it has actually been good for the people who left or who stayed behind as well as for the people who left. Now, other points. So, George was mentioning the effect of outmigration of medical professionals. So there is a great paper on the outmigration of medical professionals from the Philippines here by Michael Clemens. And he pointed out that actually precisely because if you get medical skills, you have a chance to migrate, there are many more Filipinos who actually go and get medical skills in order to get the lottery ticket of being able to leave the country. And at least he says the net result is actually the opportunity to leave the country if you're a doctor or a nurse has increased availability of medical services in the Philippines because so many people go to medical school or nursing school hoping to get the chance to get out. Many of them don't get it, and then they go and practice medicine back home anyway. So I think that's worth mentioning too.
This is not my area of expertise, but it seems to me that our society, we have an aging population with fewer and fewer children among the natives. And children are our future producers. And the immigrants have larger families and are producing more producers and are increasing in the wealth of the society, I would think, by that. And it would seem that if that's true, then it would be a logical imperative to have to maintain and be concerned about increasing immigration as opposed to restricting it.
Yeah. So basically, if you let in a lot of young immigrants, will this help save Social Security and Medicare? Short answer is yes. The more complicated answer is by how much. That's where if you go and look at those National Academy of Science estimates, it does seem like you would need to let in a very large number of immigrants to actually solve the fiscal problem. But you can make a dent in it by letting in people, especially young people. On the other hand, of course, if you let someone in when they're, say, 54, and then they work for 10 years and then immediately become eligible for benefits, then that's going to push things in the other direction. So I'd say, basically, those numbers that George was showing you on the net long-run fiscal effect of immigration, those do try to factor in all those things. The main thing that those numbers that George was showing didn't really give you was, so the CBA normally, or the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, they normally don't make forecasts about how in the world are we ever going to get out of these enormous deficits, right? So normally they basically take for granted that current policies will stay in place, or maybe with some small tweaks. If we did actually in the future go and cut benefits a lot, then this would mean that young immigrants would have paid a lot of taxes and they get a small amount in benefits, and then they would be a really good deal for us. So, and then the final thing is, anytime you look at the numbers and you say, that's not good enough, I want the immigrants to do more for us, right? If that is your view, like, there is something better to do than say they can't come. You can say, all right, they can come, but they're going to pay higher taxes, or they have to go and work for more years before they can be eligible for benefits, and or so on. Right? Now, many people say that's totally unrealistic. It's realistic to think about cutting immigration in half, but it's not realistic to think about raising raising non-natives' retirement age by a few years. I don't see why one is realistic and one is not. Right? There already are some, so like 1996 welfare reform, there were a number of restrictions that were put on immigrants' eligibility for benefits. I don't see why you couldn't have some more if that really were the concern. So, to me, a lot of arguments about immigration come down to, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you know for sure that you want less immigration, then almost anything can become an argument for less. But again, I think the wiser and more humane approach is to say, let's list problems and let's come up in an open-minded way with the cheapest and most humane way of solving them, rather than looking around for excuses for a policy that you wanted to do anyway.
There we go. Bryan, thank you for on a day of provocative presentations. Thank you for being as provocative as you've been today. You're from George Mason. My training was at Claremont, but my professors came from Virginia, and so we're both kind of descendants of Jim Buchanan, and so on. And I was thinking about some of your statements, particularly as you went through the objections, and you had asked Professor Borjas about if it turned out the gains were right, would you support immigration if the positive number was correct? A number of the objections you ended with, well, why can't we just pass a rule such as we'll let them work and live but not vote, or we'll simply deny them benefits or restrict the number of benefits that they can have? Those decisions are made through a political process, and as both students of public choice, we realize the political process has a real opportunity to pervert any type of attempt to compensate losers from the winners. So let me sort of put the question that you put in a different way. If it turns out we can't compensate the losers and we found them there, would that change your position?
No. Yeah. So I mean, actually, many of those measures I was talking about, they're often called keyhole solutions. They're not ones that I actually personally favor. Rather, it's saying, look, if this really is your big concern, there is a cheaper and more humane way of dealing with it. And in a way, it's an effort to advance the conversation and find out what exactly is your real complaint, what would it take in order to meet your concerns. I mean, the point the political process will pervert any policy reforms. Of course, the same goes for immigration restrictions too, right? So, I mean, actually, if you know the history, why did that why has immigration increased so much since 1965? I agree with George that 1965 Immigration Act did do it. Although if you go and read the legislative history, that was not the intent. The intent of the legislation seemed to basically be to keep America white without admitting it. Right? That was the goal, and that's why there's so much emphasis put on family reunification, because, if the U.S. is almost all white now, almost the only people with family abroad will be white, and then almost the immigrants will be white, but we don't have to say that we're doing it for that reason. But then they did neglect a little thing called chain migration. And they didn't realize, yes, but white people, even when they have foreign relatives, they probably don't want to come that badly. Whereas if you're the one guy who gets in from Nigeria, you probably have a lot of relatives. I think there's one Nigerian doctor who has, through chain migration, got 250 relatives in. And I'm glad to have them. But that was not the intent of the legislation. It was just that they screwed up when they were writing it and did something they didn't really want to do. And then, to me, what's really striking in terms of understanding politics is almost no one seemed to want what happened, and yet the law is still in the books. So, to me, that's just like a much broader puzzle. Like, how is it that one piece of legislation where it had effects that were very different from what were originally intended can stay on the books for so many decades? One more question.
My favorite answer to supporting legal immigration is through private charities sponsoring the entire process of immigration, job training, and naturalization in a responsible manner. But I understand a particular reason why I haven't made a significant impact on this cause, since although I am an immigrant, it's been just busy trying to make something out of my own life. So I do agree with the benefits of immigration that you presented. If you were to suggest a system where we as a whole, as in U.S. taxpayers, support this cause, making it easier for us to swallow, as simple as public education or infrastructure, what type of system are you suggesting? What would our government's role be on supporting the immigrants? And I apologize if you've already made this point and I missed it.
So what would the government's rule be on supporting immigrants, or?
Right. You know, me personally, I came through, my stepfather was in the U.S. military, and he met my mother in Japan. And I just came through that whole system. It was pretty simple. There was a lot of paperwork involved, but we were pretty, you know, privileged to go through that system. However, I can't really imagine if you were in other countries where they don't really even understand the existence of immigration program, how would U.S. government start that system, giving them the opportunity to actually integrate them into U.S. culture so that it's a long-term goal, not just, you know, they're here and then now they don't know what to do.
All right, so I mean, I continue to think the best system was that old Ellis Isla system where almost anyone in the world could just show up and say, I want to be here, and say, well, if you got bubonic plague, like, are you on like a list of the most wanted people in the world? No? All right, well, you can come in. So, you know, I think that is the best one. People often want to think about, well, what could the government do to help them when they get here? You know, I think that is the kind of, it's the kind of question that makes people nervous about letting immigrants in, right? So, like I'd say, like if there's a trade-off between letting more in and doing more for them, I think it's always better to just let more in, right? Now, in terms of, who's going to help them, so charity is great, but of course, charity is always going to be a small part of human activity. Most people just aren't that charitable, right? So, like, who actually goes and solves the problems of immigrants? I mean, the real answer has historically been business, right? Those multinational corporations that people are not so fond of, and yet they're the places that go and provide the jobs, that build the housing, right? And so, these are the groups that actually have taken care of immigrants in the past, not out of charity, but to do it for profit. And so while doing things for profit may not bring a tear to our eyes, it works, and it works at large scale. Lots of stuff happens for money, whereas the stuff that happens for charity is just much smaller. So, charity is a really nice supplement for people who, for example, immigrants who really are not going to be able to work. For them, charity is a great supplement, but for the typical immigrant, it's got to be based on they're going to be self-supporting adults who will take care of themselves and contribute, which, of course, I think almost all of them can. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryan. And I want to make a couple of quick announcements. Thank you all for being here. We're so happy to have everyone here at SCSU today, even in the cold weather. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsors again. So thank all of our sponsors for making this possible, especially our sesquicentennial celebration partners of Chartwells, Granite Equity Partners, Desert, Geocom, and Microbiologics. Everybody is invited to join us at lunch, so please move over to the Atwood Ballroom. Even if you didn't register, we have space for you. So come on over to the Atwood Ballroom for the St. Cloud Area Chamber of Commerce luncheon featuring Sangeeta Jha, and you'll learn about building bridges across cultures. I want to thank again Professor George Borjas, Kalia Yang, and Bryan Caplan for wonderful talks today, so thank you. Thank you. And good news, books from all three of our authors are now going to be on sale in the ballroom for the next 2 hours, and our awesome t-shirts that you may have seen on our student MCs. So I want to thank Hamza, Mohammed, and Jasmine for doing a great job today as well. So thank you. Thank you again. Join us for lunch and the deliberative dialogue afterwards. Head on over to Atwood and grab your food.